in Caracas, Elena Casas. Elena, nice to chat to you. It's morning where you are, and the polls, they've just opened now for a couple of hours, I believe. How are the elections proceeding at this hour?
Well, the polls have been open here in Venezuela for a couple of hours since 6 o'clock in the morning. Some of the stations I visited in opposition popular areas of Caracas had voters streaming down the pavement. They were so keen to vote this morning. But we're not actually expecting a very high turnout across the country because so many Venezuelans are feeling completely disillusioned with their entire political system. They're unhappy with the government, and it's not hard to see why. We've got inflation here in Venezuela that's set to hit 300% by the end of the year, which means that lots of ordinary Venezuelans have seen the money they earn at the end of the month disappear to a value of almost nothing. And even if you've got money, lots of basic products like flour or eggs or milk are very hard to get hold of. But that disillusionment doesn't necessarily translate into a vote for the opposition, because as you said, lots of people here, especially those in rural or poorer urban areas, have a lot of loyalty to the government. They were loyal to the government of President Hugo Chavez, who died in 2013, and they saw that his socialist administration gave them lots of benefits like free housing or healthcare or education. So that means they may not keep voting for the government because they do feel so disillusioned, but it's unlikely to translate into a vote for the opposition. So although the polls do put the opposition ahead, it's probably likely to be closer than they're saying.
But still on that, Elena, just how much of a threat then, given the conditions that we have just said, how much of a threat is this broad opposition coalition?
Well, they're not very organised among themselves. There are half a dozen different parties in the opposition. So even if they do win a majority in the National Assembly, there's a number of obstacles which will probably prevent them from making any significant legislative change in the short term. Firstly, President Maduro, the hand-picked successor to Hugo Chavez, will remain in power. And they need a majority of more than 2/3 of the Assembly in order to push for a referendum that would force him out and call for a new presidential election. Then, of course, they'll need to be able to agree among themselves, which so far they've done on little. They've said some measures that they would like to happen as soon as the new assembly takes power, like an amnesty law for what they say are political prisoners, opposition politicians who have been jailed under this government. But in terms of how to deal with Venezuela's huge economic problems, we still don't see what kind of a concrete platform they have.
Talking of the referendums, could this election really be some sort of a referendum on President Nicolas Maduro, who is the hand-picked successor of the late President Hugo Chavez?
Absolutely. Voters are seeing this as a plebiscite on Nicolas Maduro, even though he's not actually on the ballot. It's the first chance they've had since he was elected in April 2013 to go to the ballot box and make a judgment on how he's been running the economy and the country. And it's very clear that even for those who were very loyal to the socialist government, Maduro is not Hugo Chavez. He doesn't have the same charisma, he doesn't have the same personality, he doesn't command the same loyalty, and he made the mistake perhaps of swapping some of Hugo Chavez's most loyal ministers with his own people, which means that policy hasn't been quite as consistent from Chavez to Maduro as many voters were expecting. So yes, while these are legislative elections, people are turning out to vote in order to express their point of view, generally their disillusionment, their discontentment with the administration of President Maduro.
And why, Elena, have election monitors from the Organization of American States, the OAS, and the European Union, why have they been rejected to monitor these polls?
Well, there are some international observers here in Venezuela, but they only belong to organisations which have good relations with Venezuela's socialist government. So that's groups like the South American grouping UNASUR and the ALBA, which is a regional union of states that was founded by Hugo Chavez himself. The government hasn't allowed observers from countries with which it doesn't have a strong relationship to come and observe the elections. There are some senior European political figures here. The former Spanish Prime Minister, José Rodríguez Zapatero, for example, has come here as part of an international delegation to observe the vote. But the Venezuelan government doesn't have strong relations with the EU, and it hasn't decided to allow EU observers here to watch the vote. It is important to point out, though, if we're going to talk about the transparency of the process, that this is one of the most transparent electoral processes in the system. They've got an automated electronic voting system which has very careful identity checks on voters. So lots of international organisations have said that the process is very difficult to defraud. But the thing that can concerns the opposition is that most of the staff working in polling stations are loyal to the government, and they're concerned about voters who perhaps haven't voted towards the end of the day being rounded up by polling station staff and then sort of bust in to vote for the government.
All right, thank you so much. That was our correspondent there live in Caracas, Venezuela, Elena Casas.